Welcome everyone to our Reason, Research and Write webinar. My name is Anil Fernandez and I'm the Business Development Manager at the Tax Institute. Here at the Tax Institute, we have developed short courses focusing on helping you develop key skills in your professional development. We also have education offerings that are focused on practical applied learnings that you directly utilize in the workplace. As part of these short courses, we'd like to present you with this webinar on 3 of the core analytical skills that we think will help you in your tax career. These are reasoning, researching, and writing. We have here 3 representatives from the Tax Institute who will walk you through these skills through the case study they've developed and the pointers they'll share with you. Allow me to introduce. Stephanie Carides, CTA, is Tax Counsel with the Tax Institute's Tax Policy and Advocacy team and has assisted with the development of the new Legal Research and Reasoning short course for the Tax Institute. Emma Atherton is a specialist in tax research and manages Tax Line Research Service, a free unlimited member benefit at the Tax Institute. Emma assisted with the development of the research skills tutorial available to candidates. And Cheryl Go. Cheryl is our tax content consultant and managing editor of TaxVine, a member-only newsletter that gives tax professionals a weekly wrap-up of what is happening in the world of tax for that week. Cheryl specialises in creating engaging, thought-provoking and tailored content to tax professionals and is currently redeveloping the Tax Institute's Effective Business Writing Skills guide available to candidates. Over to you, Stephanie.
Thank you, Anil. Let's start with the case study. Kate works as a full-time sales assistant at one of the major department stores. Kate was looking for an outlet for her creative talent, so in her spare time she started making scented candles for enjoyment and to give as gifts to family and friends. Kate has been selling her candles at the local market at the weekend for the past 6 months. She has also set up a basic website that people can find via a Facebook page. The website contains pictures of the candles that she makes and lets people know when she'll next be at that local weekend market. She's started to receive inquiries about whether customers can purchase her candles via her website or whether they have to visit her stall at the markets. So this has started Kate thinking about whether her hobby making candles could become a real business. She is considering whether she should start selling her candles online as well as via the local weekend market. Her brother Mike suggested that she should approach some shops at their local shopping centre to see if they will buy her candles to sell to their customers. She has also noticed she's getting a lot of traffic on her Facebook page and website page as well. Mike's best friend Ben is a tax agent and has heard about Kate's hobby through Mike. He thinks Kate's hobby might be more than just a hobby and has suggested Kate come by his office to discuss. Through this case study, we will follow Ben as he works out how to advise Kate. Issues Ben identifies. During Ben's discussion with Kate, he identifies a number of issues. Whether Kate intends to make a profit, the repetition of her activities, for example, selling at the local market every weekend, what records Kate is keeping. She's recording the quantities of the ingredients she has purchased, including the glass jars and wicks for the candles. Also, what she does with the money. At the moment, all the money is going into Kate's bank account, the same account into which her wages from her retail job are being paid. Following their conversation, Ben starts thinking about how he is going to work out for certain whether this is just a hobby for Kate or whether she has a burgeoning business, in which case there might be tax implications for her. This is the reasoning part. Now Ben has to work out the issues that he needs to explore to determine whether Kate's hobby is still a hobby or is more like a business. So this is about Ben identifying the issues that he needs to consider further. For example, what aspects he needs to consider further. Identifying what is a tax-related issue or an issue that might have tax implications or tax consequences or might not, and whether he needs any further information from Kate to help him on this journey. So what are the potential tax-related issues? So once Ben has had a chance to reflect on his discussion with Kate, Ben determines that he will need to work through the following issues. What are the characteristics of a business versus a hobby? The repetition of the activities. Is this a tax issue, or does it just help characterise whether this is a business or a hobby? Kate's intention to make a profit. Is there a tax consequence? If Kate is carrying on a business, what tax registrations should she have? For example, should she have an Australian business number, GST registration, separate tax file number, and so on? What if she upgrades her website so customers can purchase her candles through the website rather than just purchasing through her weekend stall? Can she deduct the cost of upgrading her website? Is there a tax consequence here? Should Kate be reporting the money that she earns in her tax return or not? Does Ben need to ask Kate for any more information? Now, there are a number of issues that Ben has identified. Some of the issues will have tax implications and consequences, and some are just issues which Ben will need to further inform himself about to help him formulate the advice that he'll need to give Kate that won't necessarily have any tax implications. So the first thing that Ben will need to do is to sort it all out. So Ben will need to sort through the issues and weigh up how important the issues are. He will need to use his judgment for this. So it's important firstly to identify the key issues, and just be aware there could be more than one key issue. In this particular case, the key issue is whether Kate is running a business or whether this is still just a hobby for her. It's also important to identify any other offshoot type issues as well, which are still important questions that Ben needs to answer before he could form his conclusion. These offshoot issues might also have their own tax implications. Some of them are, if this is a business, what registrations are required? Does the money Kate makes need to be declared as income? Can Kate get a tax deduction if she spends money upgrading her website? The sorts of issues we were talking about earlier. Now what? Ben has worked out the issues he needs to resolve, but he doesn't know the answers. So what happens next? Let's follow Ben as he works out the main issue, whether Kate is running a business or whether this is still just a hobby for her.
Thanks, Stephanie. Now that you've established what the issues are, you want to find some answers. So where should you look? There are a number of sources of information you can look at. For example, legislation, federal, state acts and regulations, bills and explanatory memoranda, which are guidance on Parliament's intended purpose of the law and examples, ATO guidance such as rulings, case law, and other secondary sources such as journal articles and commentary. Well, isn't that what Google's for? Absolutely, Google has its uses. Using Google Advanced is a very efficient way to search within specific websites. For example, if you wanted to locate ATO information on hobby versus business, you could go to Google and put in the keywords of hobby and business, then add site:/ato.gov.au. This means that Google will search for the words hobby and business, but only within the ATO's website. It will give you ATO's customer-facing information, such as fact pages, and also more detailed practitioner materials, such as rulings. A word of warning on source. Yes, Google does an excellent job of searching the internet. However, be careful which results you rely upon. The ATO, yes, this is a good source. Wikipedia is not a reliable source. The same goes for private websites. You should always be wary of anything written by an unknown author. So you've obtained some basic information and rulings from the ATO. What's next? Legislation. One of the ATO rulings you've read refers to a section of legislation you think might be worth looking at. Section 6-5 of the Income Tax Assessment Act 1997. To find a copy of this section that you know will be current and correct, you can go to the Federal Register of Legislation. Go to Acts in Force, then IN under I for the Income Tax Assessment Act. And the Act is on that page. It's the third one down. If you click on the download button, that takes you to the page that has the entire Act broken down into manageable PDFs. You can see which volume will contain the section you want from the description to its right. In this case, section 6-5 will be in volume 1, so click on that PDF. Just be aware that legislative changes are made all the time, so be careful to always use the current edition of that section, live from the website, rather than saving it and then using it again 12 months later. Commentary and articles. Now you have the section, you think it might be helpful to read some discussions about the section, things other practitioners have written as interpretation. This is where your subscription websites come in handy. LexisNexis, Wolters Kluwer CCH, Thomson Reuters and the Tax Institute all have articles, commentary and papers that discuss the interpretation of legislation. Go to the Tax Institute website and click on the Advanced Search link in the top right-hand corner. This opens up a search page that is similar to Google's Advanced Search page. Enter the section found, 6-5, into the exact phrase search. You might want to then limit the search to within the last 2 years. You can also limit the search to just articles and papers at this point if you want to. Make sure you're logged in before you click on the link so that you can access your free and discounted content. LexisNexis, Wolters Kluwer CCH and Thomson Reuters all work in similar ways, however you will need a subscription to enable searching their content. Cases. What if you can find an example of a situation that is similar to that of Kate's? Case law is a great way to read about examples of where taxpayers have disagreed with the ATO on a matter and a decision has been made as to who is correct according to law. There are a couple of ways you can go about this. You can search for cases that consider a particular section of legislation, or you can search for a specific case. One of the cases mentioned in the commentary you found was Nelson and the Commissioner. There are subscription websites that you can use to locate cases, but if you just want to find a standard case and you have all of the citation details, you can use Ostly. So if you go to ostly.edu.au, and then on the left-hand side, under Australia, Cases and Legislation, there is a Commonwealth link. If you then scroll down, you can go to the Federal Court of Australia on the left-hand side, it's the third one down. Then go to 2014 under the decisions for the years. Now if you go Control F and enter Nelson in the search box, and that brings up the link to the case. If you click on that link, it brings you the full text of the case. By now you've got a number of reliable sources to read, which will help you work out whether Kate's running a business or if it's still a hobby. You've found the ATO's view, including tax rulings. You've got some legislation, some commentary and articles that discuss the interpretation of that legislation, and you've even got some case law. But what if my client's situation is more complicated than this and I can't find what I'm looking for? Members and students of the Tax Institute can gain research assistance from Taxline at taxinstitute.com.au.
So now that you've got your reasoning and research down pat, the next step is to translate all your ideas onto paper. Your task is to write a letter of advice to a client and for a client. This is the most exciting part because you get to craft and tailor a message of advice that will have a real-world impact on your client and their business. What you write matters. But before you become overwhelmed and have a staring competition with a blank page or a blank template, let's take it back to basics. Here are the 3 W's: the what, who, and why. The what. So what exactly is a letter of advice? It really is just that. It's a document that seeks to advise your client on key tax issues, key tax risks, and how your reasoning and research can help your client achieve their objectives in a tax-efficient way. In this case, Ben is advising Kate on whether her candle-making business is a hobby or a business. And I'll touch on what the bones of a standard letter of advice looks like a bit later in this webinar. Moving on to the who. This might be a simple concept, but asking who is my client is actually a really important question. Understanding who you are writing for is the difference between a letter of advice and a good letter of advice. In this case, the client is Kate and Ben is the tax advisor. In your case, it could be the CEO or a head of a division at a financial services company, a junior lawyer at a boutique conveyancing firm, or a founder in a small fintech startup. Keeping your audience in mind when you write your letter of advice will help you tailor your advice to make it relevant and understandable to whoever your client is. Ask yourself, are they tax professionals or do they know nothing about tax? What are their key concerns? Is my letter populated with technical jargon that only a tax professional would understand? For example, you would never write to a head of a tax division in the same way that you'd write to a founder of a startup company who might not know a lot about tax. The objective is to get your point across to your client and not to confuse them. A good tip to constantly ask yourself is, does this make sense for my client? Does Ben's advice make sense for Kate? You know now that Kate might be a gun of a sales manager in retail, but she might not be well versed in tax. So how would you go about structuring what you write based on that fact? So coming back to our case study and moving on to the why. Why is this letter of advice that Ben is writing important? Well, because Kate will rely on this letter to make sound decisions. The implications of this are whether she is in fact running a business and what compliance issues spring from this. In your case, the question is, why is any letter of advice from you as a tax advisor to your client important? Because of the same reason. Your client will rely on your letter to make commercial decisions. Your letter will help them gauge their tax implications of the problem they've come to you with. The point here is, your letter of advice is important, so definitely spend some time working on it. Keep in mind that your client will depend on your advice to make their next move to achieve their desired outcome. It has important implications. Start planning. I'd like to break down a letter of advice into two phases. The first is the planning phase. The second is the writing phase. So the planning phase is where you draw on Stephanie and Emma's webinar tips on reasoning and research. How do you plan this out in a logical way? I like to use what is called the funnel effect writing method. The funnel effect writing method is a structure of writing that helps the flow of your letter of advice, or really any writing piece that you take on. If you think of a funnel, it is structured from wide at the top to narrow at the bottom. And just like a funnel, you slowly and logically map out broader topics which then flow on to more specific issues. Adopting this method of logical writing is beneficial for both you and your client. For you, because it helps you to logically structure your letter, and for your client because they can then logically follow your train of thought. It'll help you improve the flow of your letter and connectedness of your ideas. Which then brings me to the bones of a letter of advice. A standard template of advice mimics the thought process of this funnel effect writing method. You go from wide issues to more narrow issues. The bones of a standard letter of advice. Here we have the standard headings in a letter of advice. It's a top-down approach. You go from executive summary, facts, issues, relevant law and ATO material, analysis and tax calculations, risks and uncertainties, and then your conclusion, all of which are self-explanatory and follow a logical flow. It's helpful, though, to include an executive summary at the start, which is an overview of the whole letter of advice. It's a wrap-up of the tax and legal issues that the client has come to you with. It should make sense to your client, even without the full letter attached, and allow them to quickly understand the information in your letter. The key points in the executive summary should be presented in the identical order as they appear in your letter to encourage flow and cohesion. And like a conclusion, it might be useful to write the executive summary after you've written the whole letter so that it more accurately reflects the content of your advice. So how would you go about planning this letter? Just to drill down a little bit more, here are 6 tips to help you logically plan out your letter of advice. Tip number 1, obtain, understand, distill and unpack the facts. Ask more questions if you're unsure. Tip number 2, identify the likely tax issues that arise from those facts. Tip number 3, identify and apply the rules to this area of law. Tip number 4, undertake analysis of legislation, the case law, the ATO determinations, etc. Read them carefully, pull them apart. What do particular words mean? Are there ambiguities or gaps in the law? Tip number 5, deal with uncertainty and take into account all sides of the argument. Tip number 6, if you are providing calculations, make sure to test your tax calculations. Do the numbers make sense? Test your conclusions. Ask yourself, why is this right? And confirm with yourself why it's right. Put yourself in your client's shoes. What do they need to know? What do they not need to know? Remember what you are writing, who you are writing for, and why you are writing this piece of advice. So now you can start writing. And here is where you might be confronted with that blank piece of paper and putting your thoughts into words. So here are some tips for writing well. Again, always keep your client in mind. Another good reminder is that a letter of advice is not an essay or academic paper. You don't win points for writing in the most verbose, roundabout language. The best letters are logical, clear, to the point, and provide a solution to your client's problems. Here are 6 tips to help you craft your letter. They may sound obvious, but they make a huge difference. Tip number 1, consider your reader. Put yourself in his or her shoes. Put yourself in Kate, the sales manager's shoes. What does she need to know? Tip number 2, tone of voice. A letter of advice is not the same as an email or internal memo. It's much more formal than that and represents your advice to your client, as well as the brand of your company or firm. Though to clarify, formal doesn't always mean stuffy. It's still about effectively communicating in a digestible way for your client. When in doubt, err on the formal side. It is a business document after all. Tip number 3, check your grammar, spelling and punctuation. Typos, incorrect syntax and long-winded sentences never helped anyone. It just means your letter lacks a discernible point. When in doubt, insert that full stop and start a new sentence. Tip number 4, write short, concise paragraphs and short, concise sentences. Don't confuse your client. Tip number 5, tying into that, don't be afraid to use headings, subheadings and bullet points against these paragraphs. A letter of advice is not an essay, and it's perfectly acceptable, if not encouraged, to break up your text with intuitive headings. Creating white space on a screen or on a page is actually easier on the eye and gets your point across quicker to your client. Tip number 6, choose your words carefully. The power of words shouldn't be underestimated here. For example, what would Kate do if Ben wrote, "You are running a business" versus "You may be running a business"? Is there a potential risk issue for you to write in definitive language? Consider words like should, may, probable, reasonably arguable instead. Also, many brilliant tax advisors tend to refer to technical tax and legal jargon in their advice. Ask yourself before you launch into the intricacies of Section 6.5 of the Tax Act, does Kate or your client really need to know about it? Tone down the complexity according to your client. So it's a wrap. Now that you've armed yourself with this knowledge about reasoning, research and writing, remember that practice makes perfect. At the end of the day, the best letters of advice are those that can take a complex subject and express it in simple, understandable terms to get your point across. If you'd like to know more, please refer to the Effective Business Writing Skills for Tax Professionals Guide.
Thank you, Stephanie, Emma and Cheryl. Some great insights there. Just a quick recap for everyone on the main takeaways from this webinar. Reasoning. Think about the issue you're trying to solve based on the facts you've been given and whether there are any potential tax implications or consequences. Researching. Make sure your information is current and comes from a reliable source. Writing. It's all about writing to your client and for your client. Keep it simple, think logically, and get your point across. If you find what we've covered of interest, these valuable guides and short courses are made available when you enroll in one of our subjects. Our subjects are designed to be studied while you are working full-time. They are practical skills that you can apply directly to your current work role. You will have a lecture or a webinar once every 2 weeks across the 13-week study period. We offer both face-to-face and distance for a variety of subjects, ranging from introductory tax skills, such as the CTA 1 Foundations, to specialised subjects such as the corporate tax or advanced superannuation. We also provide valuable career outcomes such as postgraduate qualification, designations, including the internationally respected Chartered Tax Advisor, CTA, and licenses for tax and BAS agents. In addition to this, you could ascertain exemptions to the CA and CPA tax modules as well. Thank you for viewing this webinar. I hope that you found some valuable information. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to contact the advisory team on 1300 Tax EDU or jump onto the website.